Thank you, Gabriel. It's a great pleasure to be here. Maybe I brought you here under false pretenses. I want to look forward, so it's more sort of the crystal ball, the tea leaves, rather than anything definitive about what has gone past. So this gives me a complete blank check to sort of say anything, and it may be a bit rambling. I'll try to structure it. I want to know where Egypt is headed. So how do we do that? Well, as Gabriella just said, I've done a piece trying to draw a historical analogy that may be misplaced, but I think there's some reason to do this. So we will look at least to the American-Egyptian relationship as part of the explanation of where Egypt is going. Because Egypt has now a strong, fearless leader in the form of General al-Sisi, I think we should take a look at that gentleman and what his predilections and preferences might be. So that's another sort of indicator of where things might be going. And then, lastly, of course, there's context in which the relationship and the leadership of Sisi will be played out, both economic and political. So we'll look at that. So to give you a sneak preview of where we may end up here, there are 3 or 4 scenarios that sort of come out of at least my speculation. And we will try to evaluate them, what the probability of any one of them is. First is that it's always safest to predict what's going on, that is to say, the status quo into the future, right? That takes the least risk. So the status quo now seems to be the military consolidating its power in something like what was the case under Nasser back in 1952 to, let's say, 56 period. And so we have a military-led modernization of Egypt that, whether in the person of al-Sisi or the military institution more generally, what we're going to have is a revived effort at military modernization. A much stronger regime, more capable of dealing with many of the issues and challenges, domestic and foreign, that the country is facing. So that's one scenario. Almost the opposite scenario is this effort falls flat on its face. That the military is not strong enough, it's not inclusive enough, it's not politically clever enough to hold the center ground that it now occupies, and it's challenged by various forces, and there's a breakdown. Even so far as the real revolution that Egypt has never had, because after all, the abortive coup of 1952 headed off what the Marxists then thought was going to be the real social revolution. And there are those who believe that that's what's happened in this period 2011 to 2013. So finally, we could argue that the authoritarian breakdown occurs and a real revolution from below then sort of sweeps it away. And we have a really profound new order coming into being in Egypt. And then there are a couple of variations on the transition scenario. That is to say that the military is not going to entrench its power, and we're not going to have the long-awaited revolution. Instead, we are going to have a more moderate transition to something like a democracy. And there are a couple of versions of this one, at least. One, which we have heard a lot about, is the Turkish scenario, only this time it's been delayed. And the Turkish scenario now would not be the 2002 until the present democratization led by the AKP. It would be going back to 1980 when the military seized power and then ultimately came to terms with Turgut Özal and the Islamists gathered under his wing. And that began a very protracted period of negotiations between principally the military and the Islamists, leading finally to the Islamists consolidating with their victory in 2002. So something like the military Islamist transition of the 1980 to 2002 period, a whole generation, right, in which gradually the Islamists learned their lesson. They couldn't challenge the regime. They had to moderate, and they were able then to reach out to other forces. So that's one version. Another version of a transition is the Brazilian model. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Brazilian model, this was with the military in power and having eradicated the left. It was decided by the Brazilian bourgeoisie that they didn't need the military anymore. that the threat posed to their interests by the left were no longer salient or particularly strong, and so they could have their cake and eat it too. That is to say, they could exercise real power without the military because the military wasn't needed to protect them against the left. So now if we simply juxtapose that interpretation to Egypt with the military extirpating the Muslim Brotherhood and reducing the power of Islamists more generally, presumably, then we might find the Egyptian bourgeoisie and liberals more generally would say, okay, well, now we're not threatened by the Islamists. The military has done us the favor of removing them. And so we can now get rid of the military through a democratic transition. So those are 3 or 4 sorts of scenarios that are possible. So let's now sort of see, if we look into the key factors, which one is the most probable of them? Well, as Gabriella said, I speculated a little bit on the analogy between the 1949 to 1954 period and the present time. Because after all, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was proclaimed by Gamal Abdel Nasser's daughter as the new Nasser. No greater authority than his very own kith and kin suggested that he was the man who has now, after all these years, inherited the legacy of the great leader of the Arabs, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and that all Egyptians should vote for him for president. Okay. So, the new Nasser. Well, to understand the old Nasser, you have to understand, first and foremost, his relationship with the United States. He was looked upon in the late 1940s by the United States as a potential leader. The United States at that time was trying to displace Britain in the Middle East, France as well, in Egypt specifically, and looking for a strong figure who would have a close relationship with Washington, who would be willing and able to reach a peace agreement with Israel, and who would be on the west side in the ever more frigid Cold War at the time. So the CIA and military intelligence cast the net to see what they could find, and Nasser was the fish they caught. And so he became the favored person in Cairo, and he provided 3 things that Nasser needed, and the reason why Nasser then essentially cozied up the Americans, promises of economic support, promises of guns, and promises of broader diplomatic support. And the relationship played itself out quite nicely from both perspectives. The United States dismissed the liberals as being too weak. Egypt was not ready for democracy. There was no point in risking a lot for the sort of bourgeoisie and liberal fellow travelers because they couldn't really deliver anything. And if that sounds like what we've had since 2011, it wouldn't be wrong. They played footsie with the Brotherhood. They knew the Brotherhood was a very strong actor. It was the alternative at the time. And there were those within the American foreign policy establishment who thought it would be better to back the brothers than to back the military. And it's not inconceivable that had the brothers gotten the upper hand in this period 52 to 54, that Washington would have backed the brothers. In the end, they did not. It was the military that got the upper hand, and the United States shifted firmly its support behind them. Again, it might sound familiar to you, because from 2011-12 until June, July of this year, the United States was clearly backing the Brotherhood, trying to have a sort of equal weight on both the foot of the military and the foot of the brothers. In the end, the military got the upper hand, and so the United States backed away from the Brotherhood. So history seems to, at least in these regards, be repeating itself. So Nasser got from this relationship money, guns, and diplomatic support, but not in the measure that he had hoped for. And one of the complicating factors was, of course, the American-Israeli relationship. That as Nasser and the Americans were coming closer, so was this deemed to be an ever greater threat by David Ben-Gurion, who was caught up in his own political struggles in Israel. And he set about trying to torpedo the burgeoning American-Egyptian relationship, and was ultimately successful in so doing. Now, this begs the question of what were the calculations at that time of Nasser. Did he really intend to forge the sort of alliance that our military intelligence and CIA people thought was in the offing? Or was he just trying to sort of lure the money, the guns, and the diplomatic support out of it? And since we don't have any historical record at all of his thinking and his behavior, we don't have the documents that he would have generated to his colleagues. We can't say with any degree of certainty whether this was whether it failed because of his calculations or not. In any case, it was clearly squaring a circle that the interests of the United States and Egypt seemed to be profoundly different. A rising nationalist-inspired regime wanting to challenge the Americans and the West more generally, at the same time sort of seeming to be working with their intelligence agencies. So this is a pretty difficult sort of circle to square, and maybe it was never in the cards. So we don't really know whether that was true or not. But what we knew, now fast forward to the present time, those of you who assiduously follow American-Egyptian relations will know that the American press, up until John Kerry's visit last week, was full of all sorts of dire predictions about the breakdown of the American-Egyptian relationship. One after another of our leading commentaries were saying that this relationship is truly under threat. I would put these folks in the category, the famous Middle Eastern category of the dogs barking and the caravan moving on. Why so? For the same reason as the period 1949 to 1954, that there were real shared structural interests on both sides in maintaining the relations. And again, it's money, guns, and diplomatic support. So, how is this relationship now being concretized between Washington and Cairo? What do both sides see in their interests? Well, for the Americans, it's cheap. The money doesn't have to be of the magnitude it was under Sadat in the late 70s, and most notably as a result of the 1979 peace treaty with Israel, which was brokered by the United States and therefore paid for primarily by the United States. The United States is not in a position to provide anything like it. Foreign assistance at that time was about 10% of Egypt's GDP. Egypt's GDP now is over $225 billion. So this would bespeak of a $22.5 billion aid package, which is simply not possible. So there'll be nothing like the sweetener there. So how can the United States sweeten the offer to keep the Egyptian political elite within the American orbit, if that's the right term? It is simply by backing the Egyptian request to the IMF and the Club of Paris for support. Assuming that Egypt is ultimately willing to undertake the reforms as requested by the IMF, reforms which will be reduced under American pressure, then the up to $50 billion that's anticipated as the total requirement for Egypt over the next 3 or 4 years could be forthcoming, because the Club of Friends, after all, includes our friends in the Gulf, and they have already provided $12 billion. So the money can come from others, the political levers can come from the United States. The guns, where do they fit into this? As we know, the United States is the principal supplier of the Egyptian military. Guns that it has been providing are entirely inappropriate for Egypt's national security needs. F-16s, M1A1s, Bradley fighting vehicles, Apache helicopters are essentially useless pieces of equipment to meet Egypt's security challenges, which are those formed by terrorism, whether in the Sinai or elsewhere, by cross-border violations, whether out of Libya or Sudan or elsewhere, including Gaza, maritime surveillance and maritime disasters, which we know are increasingly, you certainly in Italy are well aware of that problem. So a variety of more prosaic but everyday challenges, which take on increasing urgency for Egypt. So the prospects of a reformulation of the Egyptian security forces, most notably the army, but others as well, is something that the United States had wanted in 1979. When the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty was negotiated, side negotiations were going on about the future of the Egyptian military. The future of that military was anticipated to be about 250,000 strong. It was intended to be a mobile strike force, which would provide assistance to the United States in at least the area of Northeast Africa as an expeditionary force to deal with a variety of threats anticipated by the United States at that time. In the event, President Mubarak, ultimately, and General Tantawi, who oversaw the military, its procurement, its force deployment, and so on, over the next 30 years, would not have a parliament. They kept the military at 500,000. They decided that they would not be an expeditionary force, thereby avoiding being implicated in any sort of projection of power from Washington, and that they would keep the military happy by providing reasonably updated equipment that would have the so-called Janes effect, if you're familiar with the Janes publication, making it look good on paper and bolstering the military's prestige. So that's what was done. And so when the security threats manifested themselves in the Sinai from 2011 on, or cross-border surveillance in the Sudan, or cross-border surveillance with the Libyan frontier after the Libyan upheaval, and Egypt was manifestly incapable of meeting them, so did the interest begin to develop within the Egyptian military of a reconfiguration of procurement and general force structure. And that has taken the form of negotiations with the United States, which had already reached the conclusion some months ago that at least 100 million of the procurement would be redirected from the types of equipment, most notably F-16s, purchased in the past, into equipment necessary for border surveillance. So we think a little bit more about what the guns relationship might be between the new Egyptian political elite, most notably General Sisi, and the Americans. It would be the reconfiguration of the Egyptian military in the form anticipated back in 1979. That did not occur because of the political weakness on the Cairo side. Mubarak did not want to be put in a position of being allied with, in word and deed at least. The Americans, he was an Air Force officer. He did not have support in the Army. He was Sadat's poodle, as you may recall. And so his answer to dealing with the threats posed to him from his military, far and away the strongest institutional actor in the country, was essentially to buy it and then leave it be. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a much stronger figure. He's a man with a mission. And among the missions, and probably the most important, is counterterrorism, which has to include border surveillance, given what's going on. So he has every reason to reconfigure the Egyptian military. Now, if we draw our analogy back to Nasser, 52 to 54, we can begin to think of a win-win situation as far as Washington and Cairo are concerned, that the Egyptian military becomes the expeditionary force that it had hoped it would become, even in 1952, but certainly in 1979-80. That a variety of military tasks, especially in Northeast Africa, possibly in the Horn, and possibly in the Gulf, Egypt would be able to fulfill. And so, from General Sisi's side, here's a man who has indicted his opponents in the Brotherhood on the grounds that they were insufficiently Egyptian nationals, that their Islamism was a transnational Islamism without regard to the interests of Egypt, that they had elevated the project of global Islamization at the expense of support of Egypt's national interests. So you can easily imagine a General Sisi who sees that a strong Egyptian military capable of projecting Egyptian national interests into the region is something that's near and dear to his heart and near to the hearts of other Egyptians. Why did Hodab the Nasser decide that he's the new Nasser, not because of his beautiful brown eyes, but because of the idea of a strong man projecting Egyptian power. And so I think that theme is going to come back. To project that power, he has to have a credible military. The military that he has now is not credible. And we can go into the deficiencies there if you would like. So I think the guns area is one in which Washington and Cairo will have a considerable overlap of interest. That is to say, modernization of the Egyptian military. I won't go in, there's not enough time to talk about the diplomatic cover that the United States would provide in the sense of its shared economic and political interest with Egypt. We can do that in question time if you like. So who is General Assisi? What would cause him to try to reconfigure Egypt in a way that would make him get more attractive to Washington? Well, he's a man from a fairly similar background to Nasser himself. He's lower middle class. The father was a relatively successful artisan, a producer of inlaid boxes in the Muski. In this very traditional setting of the Mount Hussein area in Cairo, who employed a handful of people, very traditional figure in his economic and his social practices. So Al-Fatah grew up in a family, I believe, of 7, of which all the sisters were Muhagabat, and in which respect for Islam was an integral part of the family tradition. He seems to have imbibed of a sort of a traditional Islamic outlook. The only writing we have from him, the piece that he did for the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, is the most Islamist treatise that I've ever read by an Egyptian military officer abroad. His assumption about what democracy would constitute in Egypt was entirely inspired by an Islamist perspective, even a brotherhood perspective. So here's a man who's very traditional in his view of what an Egyptian democracy might look like. It would be one in which Islam would play an inspirational role, and its purpose would be to serve Islam. So he is someone who approaches politics very much from this traditional Egyptian al-Azhar style Islam. He's, after all, the general who spoke in defense of the so-called virginity test in April of 2011 when women demonstrators were picked up in Medan and Tahrir. His career was that of the fair-haired boy of General Tantawi. He was picked up at a young age as a young officer, and he was given exactly the cursus honorarum to prepare him for a leadership role in the Egyptian military. A little bit of service in an operational command, but most of it in the Ministry of Defense, and most vitally in military intelligence. The real sort of blessing of him was in that role. So he's a creature of General Tantawi, who paradoxically, you'd say, he removed in a coup d'etat, August of 2012. And so the paradox that strikes me can only be resolved by understanding that Assisi is truly a man of the military. And either there was a conspiracy between Tantawi and Sami Aman, the chief of staff, and Assisi, or that it was decided that to save the military as presently constituted, they had to remove Tantawi, Assisi, another 200 top generals, but to look after them and ensure that they not pay any sort of price. And indeed, they have been well looked after, both materially and in a variety of other ways. So Sisi is a man of the military. He has served its interests. He's ingratiated with it at the highest level. Now, what is the context in which this sort of new Egypt could be formed? Well, political, most importantly, before we come to economic, what sort of a political system would a man now, in sort of Nasser's shoes, choose to create? Would he want to create a single-party system the Socialist Union, the Midnight Visitors, an authoritarian top-down sort of a system that Nasser did? And the answer is it's unlikely. This is not the Marxist-Leninist era. And so to try to turn the clock back to the degree of control exercised by Nasser and his officer colleagues and the security intelligence forces and the Marxist-Leninist apparatchiks who went along with all of that and justified it seems highly improbable. This is a project that, on the face of it, would be bound to fail. Raising the question, therefore, of how does the CC exercise his influence? Does he want to become president and create something like a Nasser system, although presumably more relaxed? Or does he want to sit back and play the role that General Kenneth Evren played in Turkey in 1980, where through the National Security Council, he is able to exercise influence, and the president and the prime minister then become sort of political apparatchiks who are really subordinate to the general and his supporters in the military and the intelligence service that has now been brought under the general's control. My guess is it's the latter. So we can think of General Sisi, head of the National Security Council, as really the person who serves like Mohammed VI in Morocco or Abdullah in Jordan as the king one remove from the nitty-gritty of day-to-day politics, of running the affairs of state, of supervising over this, of certainly controlling national security policy, but other matters are discharged at the lower level, and when there are problems, the president and or the prime minister pay the price. And I think this sort of kingly general role is the one that's sort of being entertained, and most likely the one that will be adopted. The money. How do you keep a country that's been downgraded 7 times in the last 2 years by the international rating agencies, that claims to have 18 billion now in foreign reserve, but probably has less than 10, so about 2 months of import covered. A country that's run up its public debt by official figures to about 90%, but which unofficially is well more than 100% of GDP. A country that has grave macroeconomic imbalances, budget deficit of 12% of GDP at present, and so on. And all sorts of structural problems, which we can go into, but can't really address now. Well, we could imagine then, with the IMF sanctifying Egypt as a credit-worthy country, a new sort of economic look in which other partners would be sought, and there would be attempts to revitalize the rents that were essential during the Cold War era. And one of the rents, it seems to me, is that for the Suez Canal. This was, those of you who monitor Egypt closely will know, was a key issue in the struggle between the military and the Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood was trying to use the canal in the Sinai to reach out to the Palestinians and also to attract foreign interest into it. One can imagine the military now being in control, more confident of its ability to defend the canal and not having it be used by a fifth column, which they saw the brothers do, that the Chinese, among others, would be interested in the geopolitical advantages of a position along the canal, which would be implemented in economic terms. And so you develop the canal zone more than it has been as a manufacturing transit point in which those who are establishing manufacturing plants of one sort or another are drawn there not necessarily by the economic advantages, although they are substantial there, but by the geopolitical ones of having proximity to this vital waterway and into the Mediterranean and down into ultimately the Red Sea. The Chinese are the obvious one, not dissimilar to their interest in Pakistan. You can also make an argument that tourism will recover relatively quickly. It tends to. A major source of revenue, the largest single employer outside of agriculture and government. in the country. So you can put together a scenario, including payments from the Gulf and so on, that's not too bad. Where does this sort of then lead us? An authoritarian breakthrough of the developmental state sort that Nasser may have implemented in the first 6 or 7 years of his reign before it came apart. It's unlikely. It's unlikely. How do you take a state structure that has been the plaything of the military and the security services for more than a generation, in which they have extracted rents from the disposition of land and the control of hydrocarbons, most importantly, and convert that structure, which is both economic and administrative, into a truly productive economy? How can General Assisi, with the best of all possible intentions, cause rent seekers who are used to having the benefits from it into truly productive managers of an economy? And there is a huge amount of hubris on the part of the military as they being the best managers of that economy. And the more hubris there is, the less reality there is. So the idea, now, could then General Assisi push them aside and say, no, we're going to manage this political economy with the talented people who in the past have not been connected, who have not got their jobs because they served in the military or in intelligence? It seems impossible. How is he going to displace the very structure that really brought him to power? Don't forget, he's a creature of the CEO of military Inc., General Tantawi. So I think it's highly improbable that the Egyptian political economy is going to be transformed when the military is running. I think it's sort of then temporary rent-seeking, trying to grab a few billion here and a few billion there, but a fundamental transformation, I think, is highly unlikely. Authoritarian breakdown of the collapse sort, ultimately the revolution, the long-awaited revolution. Again, I think it's unlikely. And it's unlikely because there's no one there to lead. We saw the organizational deficit on the part of the liberal secularists. Post February 11, 2011, until this time, that force has remained essentially unorganized. The only force at civil and political society level that was organized were the brothers, and the brothers have been crushed. Now, the brothers could come back, but don't forget, the brothers who were crushed by Nasser in '54 did not come back in any effective way until the 1980s. That was a 30-year impact of exactly the sorts of things that have been going on since the 3rd of July. So if we are going to have this really dramatic, from the bottom up, uprising that would displace the existing structure based on the military and the security services with an overlay of sort of liberal, technical, political types, there would have to be some organizational force at work, and there isn't, and there's not likely to be one. So you can have some sorts of chaos, but chaos that would be protracted in the face of military repression, I think, is unlikely. So that leads us then in this other direction, that the military sort of runs out of gas, and unwittingly, more than wittingly, because it was not witty on the part of Turgut Özal, of Kenan Evren, that he would give birth to an Islamist Turkey. It was an accommodation that he reached with civilian political actors in order to develop Turkey, as was desperately needed. And so he reached out to Özal. Özal, in turn, built a constituency for reform and for himself among the Islamists. And so you can see this sort of a scenario playing itself out, where the military really does need to draw in civilian political actors. By no means, not all of them being Islamists. But as they're drawn in, and as they begin to get hands on capital, some structural power to their capital, they would be in a position then ultimately to begin to challenge the military's rule. So if I had to bet on a scenario here, it wouldn't be the authoritarian breakthrough or the authoritarian breakdown. It would be some sort of muddling through in which new forces created as a result of this new political economy run by the military gradually get some space and begin to try to reformulate the body politic using resources that they will have as a result of economic management and indeed economic ownership, because this is not going to be a socialist replay here. But this is going to take time. This is not going to happen overnight. We're talking of the better part, in my mind, of a generational change, as it was in Turkey. So the problem is to hold this thing together in the meantime. And that's going to be a very serious challenge. But I think it's one, for better or for worse, that Washington is committed to. And so during this interregnum, if you will, between the military running things by itself and the development of new political forces sort of under the tutelage of the military, there'll be challenges from various quarters. And my guess is that Washington and the incumbent elite in Egypt will meet them together. That this will be the sort of alliance that would have formed back in 1953, 54, 55, had there not been pressure from Israel and the Cold War. Now there's no Cold War and there's no pressure from Israel. Israel is backing General Sisi. So what didn't happen those 60 years ago now, it seems to me has every possibility of occurring. And, well, one doesn't like authoritarianism backed up by Washington. It may be better, and I'm not trying to sell it to you here, but it may be better than some of the alternatives. And I think it's sort of in the offing. And with that, I shall stop.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative talk.